So I am so excited to introduce our speaker for today. Elena Joy Thurston is the founder and executive director for a nonprofit called Pride and Joy Foundation. And they are dedicated to reducing the rate of suicide and homelessness in our community. She also, in my conversations with her, I learned that she does about 1 billion things at once and sort of runs her assistant ragged, keeping track of all of the, things that are going on in their lives. So separately, one of the things she does is works as a DEI consultant with a particular focus on LGBTQIA+ inclusion. So organizations, hire her for inclusion training, inclusive team building events, onboarding employee resource group leaders, doing keynote presentations. And the keynote presentation thing is kind of how we find her here with us today. So she went viral with a TEDx talk that she gave. It had like 40,000 plus views, and of her telling her story about recovering from conversion therapy. She loves fly fishing. I Googled her and found a really delightful nickname. I don't know if it's a nickname anybody calls you regularly, Elena, but I thought it was funny. The latter-day lesbian. This has to do with her personal story, which you'll hear about here in just a minute. But her latest focus professionally is on something called Outright Authors. It's a 6-week intensive program for LGBTQIA+ authors designed to make their nonfiction books fun to write, more likely to finish getting written, and significantly more likely to get published. So if that's something that you or anybody you know is interested in, they are actually still in an early bird pricing stage until the end of January. So you can find that at Outright, right with the W, the thing that it's all about, outrightauthors.com. So I'm going to let Elena take over from here, but suffice to say, I am really jazzed about this program. So thank you for being here, Elena.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I told both of the groups that I was in, I actually live outside of Phoenix in the Southeast area, but my girlfriend's from Tucson, and we actually go to Tucson way more often than I go to downtown Phoenix, where there is a chamber there. But I feel like these are my people. So I think this is where we're going to land. So excited to be able to do this short little presentation for you. I am going to share slides if it's okay, if I can have permission to do that, that would be great. But as an introduction to myself, I have a crazy story, like so many of us, right? I was 37, married to a man and Mormon when I came out to myself. And at 38, I came out to my family, to my community, and I immediately enrolled myself in conversion therapy. I went for 2 hours a day, 4 days a week for 6 months. And like 57% of participants, I became suicidal. And I got to a point where I decided I'd rather have my kids have a gay mom than a dead mom. And from that decision, I was able to make all these other choices in my life to embrace who I am in an authentic way. But I had lived that life for so long and in the most conservative of ways. Sometimes I wish I had like a tattoo on my forehead that said, "I'm sorry for the things that I said when I was Mormon." Like there is so much history there of acts and things that I've done and things that I've said that I feel like I'm working to kind of fix some of the harm that I caused. And it's been really interesting. That's another story for another time, but it is, I know you all understand, like it's fascinating when people come back to you later, right? And some of the most venomous people were also people struggling with their own authenticity. So that's been a really interesting experience. So I'm going to do a really quick and dirty presentation that I do. It's called Queer, Dyke, and Other Words I'm Too Scared to Say. And I am meshing that with a presentation of just 3 things that your LGBTQ coworker really wish you knew. And we start with vocabulary. So I'm going to get into that. Hopefully the technology is kind to me today. There we go. Right. So the very first thing we can do for our LGBTQ coworkers, as well as any coworkers of a marginalized identity, but it feels like the vocabulary feels really sticky around the LGBTQ community. So getting into the vocabulary is really important. It is the first step to becoming an ally or an advocate, is learning the language. And the very first step to learning the language is knowing that it's always personal. I might identify as lesbian and my girlfriend may not. You can't assume that two same gender people together identify the same way, right? So language is always personal, and how I define lesbian might be different than a way another woman might define lesbian. And so when we take it from the basis of that language is always personal, it's always evolving, it's always changing, then we can allow the space for someone to identify themselves, and then we're able to respect that in an authentic way because we understand the context around that definition and that language. So I'd really like to hear from you as far as, and unfortunately, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So maybe you can put up your fingers and let me know which one of these words is the most sticky, that you're the most uncomfortable using, that you'd like to know what is the context around that word. So often what comes up first is the word queer. So the word queer, I am a young Gen Xer, old millennial, right? I'm about to turn 43. So about my age and older, the word queer was harmful. It was used in such a harmful, derogatory way that often I have found that when I am addressing audiences that I know to be about my age or older, I'm not going to use that word because I don't know the experiences they had with that word. However, if I'm addressing audiences that are about my age or younger, they have very much embraced this word as a way of including the entire community without going through all the letters. And for some people, they don't need all the letters. For some people, all they need is the word queer, that encompasses what they feel and also gives them the flexibility to not be siloed into one of the letters, right? So oftentimes I teach that when you say LGBTQ, the Q can stand for queer. It can also stand for questioning. Most people, a lot of people spend a lot of their lives really questioning themselves and figuring themselves out. And so the Q I feel like is really important. I use the word a lot, but I also hold space for those people who do not want that word used around them or used to identify them. I totally understand that and I respect that. But again, I do use the word a lot just because, again, I feel like our community and our Gen Z part of the community, especially, they are moving away from strictly identifying as one of those letters. To them, it's very fluid, and queer seems to be a really comforting umbrella that embraces all of those. Another word that often comes up that people don't feel real comfortable using is the word dyke. And so I like to explain that, again, as a personal identifier, this is not done in a slanderous way, right? There are people, myself included, who enjoy, like, that word feels powerful to them, and it feels very much like who they are and what they're about. One of my favorite stories around this word is I was teaching a big group, I think it was Logitech. And Logitech, we were there and I was talking about the word dyke and about how especially the younger generation has really embraced this as meaning any woman, lesbian woman who walks into a room and really has power and can command it. And one of the workers, while I was on this call teaching this concept, she turned around and she lifted up her hair, and everyone, we were on a Zoom call, and everyone in the room was like, what's going on? And she lifted up her hair, and across her back and on her neck was this beautiful tattoo of the word dyke. And you should have seen the faces of the coworkers in that room. They had never seen it before. It was beautiful. And it was such a great way to show that when we come together in a safe space to talk about vocabulary, that's when authenticity can really come out because it's respected and it's safe. So another one on here that is often brought up in meetings that we feel really sticky about, or we've just never heard it before, is the word TERF. So TERF is an acronym and it stands for Trans Exclusive Radical Feminist. So this is a woman who says trans women aren't real women and they should not be afforded access to women's spaces. So the reason why TERFs you need to know about this concept, especially if you have a trans person in your life, is that they often hide under the guise of feminism. And so I've done it myself, walked into a space, whether it's in real life or virtual, thinking that it's like a powerful woman's feminist space. And then you get sucked in and you realize, oh no, really the only reason all these people are here together is because they want to exclude trans women. And so knowing that this group is very much in reality, and it can get easy to be misguided onto who they are. So it's really important, if you do have a trans person in your life, that you're aware that that group exists, and maybe that you're aware that your friend or your loved one needs to be protected and advocated for against groups like this. And often when you have, for example, all of these bills that are in our state legislature right now, especially so many of them being anti-trans, so TERFs often lend legitimacy to that point of view, because what you're seeing is they're moms, right? Or they are women who are out working and serving in the community. And so when they go and they testify in support of these anti-trans bills, it kind of humanizes it, right? It makes it a little softer because they're looking like just women who are looking out for the world. And so it's a really interesting ideology, and one that can be very harmful. And I often say here, the queen of the TERFs is a very popular children's book author, and it has very much colored a lot of our feelings about her works. And she has really led a legitimacy campaign to this feeling of it being anti-trans. And so it's really something to be aware of. I just want to wait. Okay, I can see the chat. Excellent. 6 and 11. Awesome. So I need to make sure that excellent. So cisgender, I would like to go over that really quick. Cisgender refers to anyone who identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And we could go into a whole conversation about the science of gender, and that's a topic for another time that I love to talk about. But anyone who identifies as the gender that they were assigned at birth is cisgendered. I am cisgendered. I identify as a woman. That is what I was assigned at birth. Cisgender people, the bigger part, the context that we need to understand is that cisgender people hold a lot of privilege, like so much privilege. To go through my life, 43 years now, and to never have to question which bathroom is going to be most safe for me. Am I going to be able to get this job? Because they can easily put me into a gender silo that they recognize. There is so much privilege that comes with being cisgender. And so that is part of when you hear someone say, he's a white cisgendered man, right? That is part of what they're saying, is that's the privilege that comes with that. And I understand, frankly, probably not to the depth that I need to, but that I have lived a life of privilege. And so that can be part of my identifier. I understand that I'm perceived as white, and I understand that I lived a cisgendered life and the privilege that comes along with that, along with lots of others, right? So I think we've gone through the vocabulary. I'll check the chat to see if there's any other questions there. Excellent. Yeah, lots of things to reflect on. All right. So just to go through them, let's make sure we touch on pronouns. Please don't use the phrase preferred pronouns. These are just pronouns. This is just how we identify. They're not preferred. No one's being a special snowflake by asking you to use a certain pronoun. It's just giving space that there are other pronouns other than she and he, right? And frankly, the use of they and them has been around a long time. A lot of people in the straight community feel like, oh, this is a new thing. This is a new trend. I got to get around this new language. No, actually what's happened is that mainstream America has caught up to the fact that there are non-binary and trans people existing. They've used the neo-pronouns for a long time. So again, it's not preferred pronouns, it's just pronouns. And inviting people to share their pronouns really increases the amount of inclusion and belonging that people feel in the organization that you're around. I try to always introduce myself with my pronouns. I'm not very good at it, but I keep trying. My assistant, my director of operations, is non-binary. Their pronouns are they, them. And the beauty that I have found in our neo-pronouns is that when we are in a meeting with my director of operations and someone misgenders them, and I'm able to just stick in a little they, them. They're non-binary. It's they, them. And when I'm able to advocate for them, not only does it help the person who's trying to learn and trying to do better, but I get to watch Braden's face. And it's like the coolest thing to be able to advocate for the gender that they are without them having to do the emotional labor themselves. I love Braden and I can't pay them as much as I want to. And so I feel like this is like a golden opportunity to let them know how much I appreciate them. So if you have someone in your organization who has pronouns that you might be struggling with, know that every time that you advocate for them or every time that you correct yourselves, it's like an act of love. It's a hug for them. And in a time when we can't share a lot of hugs, that's kind of a big deal. So we went over the queer for questioning. And then real quick, we're just gonna talk about the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. They are different.
Can I interrupt real quick, Elena? There was a
Yeah.
question in the chat, and it's not a question I asked, but it is a question that I too have. Is there a right or wrong way to ask for someone's pronouns?
Thank you so much. And thank you for breaking in, because that is a really important question that very few people ask. So if you are in a job interview specifically, like you're interviewing a candidate, you cannot ask for their pronouns. That's a no-no. However, what you can do is you can say, "Hi, Mike, my name's Elena Joy. My pronouns are she, her." And that invites them. And if they want to share their pronouns with you, they will at that point. And then, of course, it's up to you to remember, which can be the challenge. So the only wrong way is if you're in a job interview as the interviewer, you cannot ask for their pronouns, but you can prompt by sharing your own. And that's always a healthy way to do it. It's a great habit to get into, that every time you introduce yourself like that, you're including your pronouns. You get into that habit, your brain does it. And then when you're in, like, let's say a Zoom or networking meeting like this, and someone has not shared their pronouns, and so you're not interviewing them, right? And if you would like to, you can again introduce yourself. "My name's Elena Joy. My pronouns are she, her." And I will say, there have been times when I've been on calls, not in a work situation, and I wanted to know so that I can make sure that I'm not misgendering them. And so I will just say that. Recently, it was a person named Anne, and I try not to assume gender anymore. And so that's kind of how I bring it up. "Hey, Anne, I know we're 5 minutes into this meeting. I try not to assume gender, just as my own priority. So would you mind sharing your pronouns?" That can be a great way to do that invitation without worrying about anything. And they can always say no. That's totally fine. Or they can share their pronouns with you. And oftentimes, I will say, understand that there are quite a few people that will use their more authentic pronouns, not at work. Oftentimes work doesn't feel like a safe place. Now in Tucson, that might be different, because it feels like Tucson is so much more accepting. But as I speak around the country, I have several people tell me, "Please don't tell my bosses, the administration, or whomever to require pronouns like in my email signature." Because it can be an invitation, it can be optional, but it creates an issue for me because I don't feel safe at work sharing my pronouns. And then, of course, we have to go back and we have to discuss culture and safety and belonging. So hopefully that answers that question of how you can invite pronouns. Excellent. And so going into the sexual orientation, gender identity, they're all kind of mixed up in the letters: lesbian, gay, trans, bi, Q, right? They're all together. But one of my favorite ways of kind of showing the distinction is sexual orientation, gender identity is how you go to who you are when you go to bed at night. Who is it? Who are you? And sexual orientation is, who do you want to be sharing that bed with you? Or not sharing that bed with you if you're asexual. And we'll go into that a little bit. And so you have gender identities and you have sexual orientations, and they're actually not dependent on one another at all. And so starting to try to separate those two in your head is really helpful, because then you can really authentically embrace what a gender identity is and not mixing it up with what a sexual orientation is. However, the community altogether is the queer community. It is the LGBTQ community. We are all in this together because we are in such a marginalized population. But when we're trying to authentically respect who people are, we need to kind of separate what is sexual orientation and what is gender identity. And I know I'm kind of speeding through this, and I apologize, but it's kind of for the time. And so asexual people, that definitely refers to people who don't need a physical intimacy to feel whole or to feel connected to a partner if they choose to have one. Pansexual, I love. It is most easily understood when you understand non-binary. So a non-binary gender identity. The binary is male or female, which we now know is a false construct because Unless you're testing genetic code, you don't actually know what gender people are. But in a binary world, you have male and female, and a non-binary person is someone who doesn't identify strictly with one of those. Now, it might be someone who identifies as one day or one the other. They might be a certain side of center, like you might hear the phrase masculine of center or feminine of center, and yet they can still be a non-binary person. And a non-binary person does not owe anyone looking androgynous. You do not have to look androgynous to identify as a non-binary person. And a pansexual person is someone who's attracted to other people regardless of their gender. So I was like, well, isn't that everyone? Like when I first heard that, right? Like, aren't we supposed to be attracted to just the soul? But then I thought about it and I realized, yeah, there's not a man on this earth I'm attracted to. Like, there's literally no way I could be in an intimate relationship with a man. It's just what it is. Now, everyone else, I'm holding out hope that there's a possibility I could be attracted to them. But if they identify as a masculine man, it's probably not going to happen for me. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen for someone else. And so pansexual is definitely an evolved sense of orientation in my eyes. It's someone who the gender truly doesn't matter. The packaging truly doesn't matter to their physical connection with someone else. I think it's beautiful. And I kind of wish I was there, but I am not, frankly. So I do not identify as a pansexual. So if you have someone who maybe is like me, is a lesbian, thinks they're only attracted to women, right? And then they fall in love with someone who's non-binary. Well, then that person might change their orientation and feel like, no, pansexual actually is more accurate for how I feel, okay? And then a big thing to understand, especially with your trans coworkers, are there different types of transition. There's a social transition where you are changing your name, you might change your pronouns, and you might be specific with who you've done that with, right? So there's a social transition. Then there's a medical transition, and whether that's surgery or whether that's hormones or whatever that is, that's where there's something physical happening, right? And that's something to really be aware of with your trans coworkers. If they're going through a medical transition, okay, think about this. Remember when you were like ages 13 to 18 and like how you didn't even like connect with your body, like you were so unfunctional and the hormones were just coursing through your body. Okay, now take that and squish it down into a year or two of daily hormone treatment. I don't know how people do it. And I think it's absolutely amazing. And they have my utmost respect because I would go crazy. Like that amount of hormones in me would be not good for anyone around me. So I think anyone who goes through medical transition, they deserve so much respect because that is not easy. And then you have a legal transition, which sometimes falls in there somewhere with the social and the medical, but dang, it's not easy. There's so much paperwork to figure out. There's like this constant proving, right? So if you have a coworker going through a legal transition, like they definitely need some emotional support because that is not an easy effort either. So hopefully that kind of helps there with what your LGBTQ coworkers really wish you knew. And now we're into part 2, which is do your research. Regardless of what your position is in your company, review and revise your anti-discrimination and harassment policy to make sure there is specific language. If your company's policy is, we respect all people, we include all people, you can't bully anyone, that is not specific enough, not in this day and age. In June of 2020, the Supreme Court put out a ruling that discrimination and harassment at the workplace is not acceptable under specifically sexual orientation and gender identity. Before, we only had about half the states providing workplace protections around those two, sexual orientation and gender identity. But now we have nationwide coverage. Now, it didn't go through Congress, so everyone can always argue that. And yet we already have precedent set that you can file a case if you can prove that there's been discrimination or harassment based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. And many companies aren't aware of that yet. Hence, I'm brought in because they are a huge risk for lawsuits. And usually at this point in the presentation, I go through like 3 different real world scenarios that I've worked with in the last 6 months, but that would take a lot of time. So we can go through that at the end if you want. It's really helpful to see like, oh, I could see that taking place at my company. We probably want to prevent that from happening. Like that's where the gold is in that. And then One more thing to be aware of and do your research is the awareness of population trends. Now, all of these numbers are pretty conservative. Gen X identifying at about 8%. That's the most conservative survey that's out there. The least conservative goes up to about 15%. Millennials, you can find surveys anywhere between 10% and 20%. But Gen Z, Gen Z is blowing it out of the water. So Gen Z is fascinating because the same group of, I think, 10,000 youth in the US and 10,000 youth in the UK, that's the subject matter of that survey. They were all asked the same question. How do you identify it? And there's a big long list. We've all seen them, right? Lesbian, bi, gay, trans, right? The big long list. And they had to check one or more. And Gen Z was like, nah. Nah, they just didn't answer the question. They answered the other questions, but they would not check one of those boxes. So the people at the research company were like, well, okay, I guess we'll ask it a different way. And so they found a whole new group of 10,000 youth, and they said, do you identify as strictly heterosexual? Yes or no? And 30% in the US and 33% in the UK said, no, I am not strictly heterosexual. Gen Z is changing the game. Gen Z right now is ages 14 to 25. Therefore, they're going to be a huge part of our workforce in the next 10 years. Do the managers of today's workforce understand what's coming to them? It is a different ballgame. And then it goes even deeper when you look at the rate of, the fact is Gen Z, of those identifying as LGBTQ, 40% of them identify as trans or non-binary. That's huge. That takes gender identity, that takes bathroom access, that takes everything to a whole new level. And then if you add on top of that, I've done some research and I've published a few articles about the crossover of neurodiversity and LGBTQ people. So neurodiversity stands for autism, ADHD, ADD, like all the different ways that our brains can be wired a little differently. And the LGBTQ community, 48%. It's huge and it's amazing. And the sooner that our workplace managers can understand, like, not only do you get an incredible diverse candidate when you have an LGBTQ person, but you're going to get someone who thinks differently. Their concept of innovation is totally different than a neurotypical person. It is so cool to see. And I think it could be absolutely amazing to see the problems that our Gen Z solves. I'm so excited for them. And so this is what I often suggest for people. If you have 100 people on your team, kind of break out, like, what generations are they in, and then check the percentages. And if the percentages don't match up as far as the people that are out, you might have a culture issue. They might not feel safe to be out in your workplace. And so that's something to consider. Now, if you have a team less than 100, like, obviously the numbers are skewed. The more people you have, the more accurate that those percentages will be. But it is a really great way to kind of assess, how safe is it in our company for people to be their authentic selves? Are you representing the entire population? So there's one final thing that I love to share, and I'm just going to pause here for a minute. One final thing that your LGBTQ coworker really wish you knew. Coming out is not a one and done thing. Coming out happens every day, multiple days. Yes, we all have that story of, like, when did you come out? And we all have that story when we told our people, our parents, whoever it was. And you can ask that story, and if we're in the mood, we'll tell you. But the fact is, coming out happens every day. And we have to constantly assess, are we in a safe enough environment that we can be truthful about who we are? For example, I get off the plane at the airport and I get in an Uber to come home, and the Uber driver, a random guy, I might only know his first name, and I'm alone in his car, and he says, oh, are you going home to your husband? I bet you missed him. I get to decide in that moment. Am I going to be who I really am, or am I going to protect myself? And it happens every day. It happens at the grocery store when we check out our groceries. Oh, are you making steaks for your husband? That's so cute. He must love that. I live in Queen Creek, Arizona. I am looking around and deciding, am I just going to lie and make my life easier? Am I going to be authentic and wonder what is going to be the reaction of the people around me? And do I have the emotional bandwidth to deal with that right now? So when you're hanging out with your LGBTQ coworkers, and they might say something like, oh yeah, my kid had meet the teacher last night. We went and met their teachers. And you ask, how did that go? Be prepared for an answer that you might not want to hear. But at least you're being there for your coworker. And they get a sense that you're understanding what their day-to-day life is like. You want to talk about increasing a sense of safety and belonging at the workplace? That's where it is. Those are the contexts that when you can start to understand them, you can start to really show up for your people that way. So I hope that was helpful. Yeah, those are just some of the things that we offer.
Goosebumps, Elena. This is amazing. Thank you for this presentation. I mean, maybe we can be lucky enough one day to have you come back and talk more, because I would you talk about whatever.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really great. And I'm really glad to be a part of this group. All right.
Yeah.
Are there any questions or anything that I can, if you have comments or feedback? It's always a little nerve-wracking talking to a group where I know the majority are fellow queer people, because they're like, I don't know if you did that right. and that's totally fine. We all experience it differently. And so I am totally open to critique, especially when I'm talking about gender identity. Man, I rework that section every single time, hoping that I'm being as respectful as possible.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any questions come across in the chat. It's mostly just complete support. It gives me hope to know that you're out there giving this presentation to people in leadership who really, really need to hear it. I think that it was accessible, and yeah, I'm sure it's being received.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you. We hope to see you around here more. We're happy to have you at future programs. And next month might be a fun one, the Ask Me Anything panel.